We did a lot of the show with marionettes and hand puppets, and we do kind of both kinds of puppets.
In 1982, Jim Henson created something so disturbing that he couldn't even bring himself to touch it. This wasn't just another puppet for his famous Muppet Show. This was something darker, something that made the man who brought Kermit the Frog to life actually step back in fear. He built it, perfected every terrifying detail, and then handed it to his assistant and walked away. For years, that puppet sat in storage while Jim continued working on other projects, but whenever he visited the workshop, he never went near it. His family later found notes that explained exactly why he was so afraid of this creation. What he learned about this puppet changed everything he thought he knew about his own work. But before we get to that shocking story, let me tell you about the man who created it and why this moment was so important. Jim Henson was born in Mississippi on September 24, 1936. His father worked for the government studying crops and soil, while his mother came from a family that loved art and creativity. Jim grew up in a small, quiet town surrounded by nature. He spent hours watching animals move, listening to people tell stories, and dreaming up his own characters in his head. His grandmother was always making things with her hands. She painted, sewed quilts, and created beautiful designs. She passed that creative spark directly to young Jim. Those peaceful days in Mississippi taught him how to watch the world carefully and bring characters to life in ways nobody had ever seen before. When Jim turned 11, his family packed up and moved to Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. That move completely changed his life. One day, his parents brought home their very first television set. Jim later said that moment was the biggest thing that ever happened to him as a kid. Suddenly, he could see moving pictures right in his living room. His mind exploded with new ideas. He started thinking about how puppets could work on television screens instead of just on theater stages. Even though his family followed a religion called Christian Science, there's a false rumor that goes around saying Jim refused medical treatment because of his faith. That's not true at all. It was just gossip that spread after he died. Moving from the slow, peaceful countryside to the busy suburbs near the nation's capital opened up a whole new world for Jim. He now lived close to television studios and could actually imagine himself working in that exciting new industry. Jim didn't sit around waiting for opportunities to come to him. When he was just 10 years old, he started building his own puppets, using whatever materials he could find lying around the house. One of his very first characters, which eventually became the early version of Kermit the Frog, was made from his mother's old green coat. He used 2 halves of a ping-pong ball for the eyes and some denim fabric for the body. Jim didn't use the old-fashioned wooden puppets that people were used to seeing. Instead, he created soft, flexible puppets that could actually move and show real emotions. He believed that a puppet should be able to do whatever a human hand could do. That simple idea changed puppetry forever. As a young boy, Jim became completely fascinated with a famous entertainer named Edgar Bergen. Bergen was a ventriloquist who performed with dummy puppets like Charlie McCarthy. The interesting thing was that Bergen wasn't even that good at ventriloquism. You could actually see his lips moving when the puppet talked. But here's what amazed Jim. The audience didn't care. They treated the puppet like it was a real person and completely forgot about the man holding it. That idea stuck in Jim's brain and never left. When Edgar Bergen died in 1978, Jim spoke at his funeral. He even dedicated the Muppet movie to Bergen's memory. Later, Bergen's family sent Jim a photograph with a message written on it that said, "Dear Jim, keep the magic alive." Those words meant everything to him. During high school in Maryland, Jim started performing with puppets on local television shows. This was back in 1954, and he was still just a teenager making his first appearances on TV. He didn't use the boring old setups where stiff puppets sat on a wooden stage. Instead, he experimented with different camera angles and filming techniques that made his characters feel alive and exciting. He looked up to famous TV puppeteers like Burr Tillstrom and Bill and Cora Baird. Then in 1955, while he was in his first year at the University of Maryland, a local TV station called WRC-TV hired him to create a short puppet show. He called it Sam and Friends. The show aired twice every single night. Just 3 years later, in 1958, Jim won his very first Emmy Award. He was only 21 years old. Jim started college thinking he might become a commercial artist. He chose studio art as his major subject, but then he made a really surprising decision. He graduated in 1960 with a degree in home economics. That was really unusual for men back then. But Jim had a smart reason for doing it. He wanted access to the university's best equipment for designing sets and costumes. As a freshman, he even joined a senior-level puppetry class where he met a young woman named Jane Niebel. She would eventually become both his creative partner and his wife. People who saw Jim in that class said he already seemed like someone who was going to change the world someday. Now here's where Jim's work starts getting really interesting and kind of disturbing. In 1957, Jim and Jane got hired to make advertisements for a company called Wilkins Coffee. They created 2 puppet characters. One was named Wilkins, who loved drinking coffee. The other was named Wantkins, who refused to drink it. There's a myth that Jim never performed the Wantkins character because the commercials were too violent, but that's completely false. Jim performed both characters himself. Between 1957 and 1961, they made 179 different coffee commercials. Each one lasted only 8 seconds, but they were absolutely shocking. In these tiny commercials, Wantkins would get violently punished for refusing to drink Wilkins coffee. He got shot with guns, blown up with explosives, electrocuted, thrown off tall buildings, and even tied to electric chairs. These commercials ran in the smallest time slots on television, just long enough to shock people, make them laugh, and leave a lasting impression in their minds. Jim personally directed all of these violent scenes. He didn't hold anything back or make them less intense. One commercial showed Wilkins sword fighting and wiping blood off his blade after stabbing Wantkins. Another showed Wantkins having to pay more money for his lunch just because he didn't drink coffee. Some viewers complained, saying the ads were way too violent for television. In response, Jim made a joke commercial where Wantkins joins a fake anti-violence group. But no matter what critics said, the commercials were never banned from television. They worked too well. Jim later explained that advertisements didn't always need to directly sell a product. Sometimes humor and shock could be much more effective. This wasn't just about selling coffee. Jim was testing whether puppets could work in shows meant for adults, not just children. His later shows, like The Muppet Show, grew directly from these early experiments with darker comedy. By 1969, everything changed again for Jim. A woman named Joan Gans Cooney from the Children's Television Workshop asked Jim to work on a revolutionary new show for kids. That show became Sesame Street, which first aired on November 10, 1969. Jim created some of the most famous characters, including Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, Grover, and Cookie Monster. But the show immediately caused controversy. In May 1970, the state of Mississippi actually banned Sesame Street from being shown on television because it showed children of different races playing together. They said their state wasn't ready for that. The show was praised by television critics but attacked by some conservative politicians. Even so, it won 20 awards in its very first year on the air. The show was a complete revolution in children's education. But behind the scenes, Jim was exhausted and close to quitting. In 1970, just 1 year after Sesame Street began, he was tired of constant creative battles with executives and producers. He almost walked away from everything, risking the entire show's future. But he stayed, and it was the right choice. In the mid-1970s, Jim wanted to create something completely different from Sesame Street. He tried launching a variety show with puppets, but every single American television network rejected his idea. It was humiliating. That's when a British producer named Lou Grade said yes and let Jim make the show in England. That decision changed everything. On September the 5th, 1976, The Muppet Show aired with its first guest star. Within just 3 years, by 1979, the show was broadcast in over 100 countries and watched by 235 million people around the world. Every single episode cost $130,000 to make, making it one of the most expensive puppet shows ever created. Famous celebrities like Elton John lined up begging to appear on the show. The Muppet Show ran for 5 full seasons and ended on March 15, 1981, with a total of 120 episodes. But the success came at a terrible price for Jim. Personally, his schedule was absolutely brutal. He voiced Kermit, directed scenes, managed scripts, and helped fix broken puppets after filming. By 1978, the stress became too much for his body to handle. He almost collapsed during one shoot. His creative partner, Frank Oz, had to step in and direct episodes when Jim couldn't. At the exact same time, Jim started working on The Muppet Movie, which began filming on July 5, 1978. He was burning himself out completely. And that brings us to 1982, and the puppet that Jim became too afraid to touch. That year, Jim decided to make a completely different kind of film called The Dark Crystal. This wasn't going to be a happy, funny Muppet movie. This was going to be a dark fantasy film with absolutely no human actors at all. Every single character would be a puppet. Jim wanted to prove that puppets could tell serious, frightening stories meant for older audiences. He poured his heart and soul into designing creatures that looked beautiful but also deeply disturbing. The film showed puppet characters actually dying on screen. It had themes about death, good versus evil, and mystical powers that shocked parents who brought their young children to see it. The movie cost $15 million to make and earned $40 million at the box office. But the dark, scary tone made many people uncomfortable. Parents complained. Critics didn't understand what Jim was trying to do. The movie almost bankrupted his entire company. It was during the creation of The Dark Crystal that Jim built the puppet he could never bring himself to touch. He spent weeks perfecting every horrifying detail of this particular creature. He worked on it obsessively, making sure every aspect was exactly right. But as he worked, something changed inside him. He started to realize that he had created something that felt too real, too disturbing, too alive in a way that scared him. When he finally finished building it, he looked at what he had made and felt genuine fear. Not the fun kind of scary feeling you get from watching a horror movie. Real, deep fear. He handed the puppet to his assistant and walked away from it. He never touched it again. For years afterward, that puppet sat in storage at his workshop. Jim would visit the workshop to work on other projects, but he would deliberately avoid going near that particular puppet. He couldn't even look at it without feeling unsettled. After Jim died in 1990, his family went through his personal notes and journals. That's when they found pages where Jim had written about this puppet and why it affected him so deeply. Jim wrote that while creating this puppet, he had discovered something terrifying about his own creative process. He realized that when he made his puppets, he wasn't just building objects out of foam and fabric. He was somehow putting pieces of himself into them. Every puppet carried emotions, memories, and parts of his own personality. But with this particular puppet from The Dark Crystal, something went wrong. Jim wrote that he had accidentally put too much darkness into it. He had poured in fears and nightmares that he didn't even know he had inside himself. When he looked at the finished puppet, it was like looking into a dark mirror that showed him parts of his own mind that he didn't want to see. The puppet reflected back emotions and thoughts that scared him. It was like he had created something that knew his deepest fears and could somehow use them against him. This discovery changed everything Jim believed about his work. Up until that point, he had always thought of puppetry as pure creativity and imagination. He believed he was in complete control of what he made. But this puppet proved him wrong. It showed him that the creative process could tap into deeper, darker places in the human mind than he had ever realized. Jim wrote in his notes that creating this puppet taught him that artists don't always control what they make. Sometimes the art takes on a life of its own and reveals things the artist didn't want to face. This puppet became a turning point in how Jim thought about creativity, fear, and the power of bringing imaginary creatures to life. The tragedy is that Jim never got to fully explore or understand what happened with that puppet. On May 16, 1990, Jim Henson died suddenly from a bacterial infection in his lungs. He was only 53 years old. In the days before his death, Jim had been coughing up blood but didn't tell anyone because he didn't want to worry people or seem like he was making a big deal out of nothing. When he finally collapsed at 4 a.m, he was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The infection had caused toxic shock, and his organs started shutting down. Doctors said that if he had come to the hospital just 12 hours earlier, they could have saved his life. But Jim had waited too long. One of his last sentences to his son, John, was, "I'm going to be fine." But he wasn't fine. The man who had created Kermit the Frog, Big Bird, and countless other characters that brought joy to millions of people around the world was gone. The puppet that Jim was too afraid to touch still exists today, preserved in storage as part of the Jim Henson Company's archives. Very few people have ever seen it in person. Those who have report that it's unlike any other puppet Jim ever created. It's not cute or funny or even traditionally scary like a monster from a horror movie. People say it's deeply unsettling in a way. That's hard to describe. It has a quality that makes you feel uncomfortable just being in the same room with it. The puppet serves as a reminder that Jim Henson was so much more than just the friendly man behind Kermit the Frog. He was an artist who was willing to explore the darkest corners of creativity, even when it frightened him. He pushed boundaries that other puppeteers wouldn't dare to cross. And sometimes, in pushing those boundaries, he discovered things about himself and about the nature of creativity that were genuinely terrifying. Jim Henson's legacy is complicated and fascinating. Most people remember him for Kermit singing Rainbow Connection or for the colorful educational world of Sesame Street. But Jim was always trying to break free from being seen as just a children's entertainer. He wanted to prove that puppets could tell any kind of story, including dark adult stories that dealt with fear, death, and the mysterious parts of human nature. The puppet he was too afraid to touch represents that ambition and the risks that came with it. It shows us that even the most talented and creative people can create something that scares them, something that shows them parts of themselves they didn't know existed. So if you enjoyed learning about this incredible and disturbing story, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves Jim Henson, the Muppets, or the Dark Crystal. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another fascinating story about the hidden histories behind your favorite movies, shows, and creators. Jim Henson changed the world with his puppets, but he also showed us that creativity can take us to places we never expected to go, including places that frighten us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.